This is the first of 4 lectures on the topic of the symbolic other, sometimes referred to in the Lacanian literature as the big other. The way we will develop this topic is by putting it in dialogue with some of the ideas that we've already discussed in talking about Lacan's notion of the mirror stage. And in fact, the best way I think of introducing this topic of the symbolic other, and I've subtitled this first mini lecture, The Third in Any Dialogue, is by pointing to some of the areas of irreconcilability and impasse that the mirror stage theory directs our attention toward. So just before doing that, let me pose one question, and then we'll try and do a little sketch of some of what I've called the intractable conflict emerging from the theory of the mirror stage is. So the question is, who could we say that suicide notes are addressed to? That's the first question. And the second question is, why is it that for Lacan of the early seminars, in fact you could say for Lacan period, why is it for Lacan that each instance of speech implies a listener? Each instance of speech, each utterance implies some kind of interlocutor, some kind of position of hearing. Why would he say that? Right, let's then have a look at what we might consider to be a tentative definition of the imaginary and some of the problems that are posed by this idea of the imaginary. When I was thinking about how to best try to convey this concept, the image that came to mind was that of an image from the animal kingdom. And I think it's influenced by Lacan. I forget whether he uses this exact example, but he uses a similar one. If we've got 2 male tigers, it's unlikely that the 2 male tigers, or let's make them 3, 4, 5, a group of male tigers will somehow form a truce and have a group. There can be no king of tigers in the sense of a whole community of tigers regulated, organized by one single tiger. Why so? Because in the animal kingdom we often find, and I think we get this in the idea of like the alpha male whatever, is that there tends to be rather, particularly I'm guessing in the realm of tigers, there tends to be one single leader. Or differently put, there tends to be a situation whereby there'll be a type of one-on-one conflict, one will die, one will triumph, and that's the remaining person. So when I'm saying that there's no king of tigers, I mean there's no community of tigers that is defined by any kind of truce or some kind of symbolic pact. Why I'm emphasizing that is that you could say that one of the main outcomes, one of the implications of the mirror stage theory is that intersubjective ego-to-ego relationships almost invariably involve, or by definition invariably involve, a degree of conflict. And that conflict is not something that can be resolved in and of itself. To resolve those kinds of conflicts, you would need, by definition, some appeal to a third party, some kind of arbiter, some kind of judge, some kind of locus of knowledge, some kind of arbitration in order to resolve those conflicts. So let's give a few more examples of the kind of conflict that I'm speaking about. And we'll recall here that the mirror stage is the domain of the imaginary. It's the paradigm for thinking about, the paradigmatic example for thinking about the imaginary dimension. The imaginary dimension is populated with examples of the ego in its relationship to its image. The ego falling in love with, narcissistically falling in love with an image that it takes to be the very basis of itself, but also perennially having conflict with that exact same image, wanting to eradicate the image, wanting to do away with the image, and in a sense thus also doing away with oneself. This is what I mean by using this notion of mutually assured destruction and saying that there can only be one in the mirror stage. The mirror stage, this dyadic dual relationship between the subject and its image, the ego and its image, is kind of like a duel. It's kind of like a bout. It's kind of like a boxing match where aggression, where conflict is guaranteed, and in those situations of one-to-one conflict, there's only going to be one winner. There's going to be someone who dies and someone who prevails. So 2 quick examples of that. if we could imagine some kind of sporting situation, let's make it a contact sport, some kind of aggressive sport. If we're thinking of, let's take soccer, or people in the United Kingdom want to call it football, so let's call football soccer. There is a flare-up between two players. They are both the number 3 on their respective sides, let's say, for example. They're the opposite number. There's a flare-up, they get a little bit aggressive, they start pushing, they start wanting to have a little bit of fisticuffs. What happens? Presumably you need a referee, you need some kind of umpire or referee to run in and say, you stop, blow my whistle, and we solve this. The idea here being that those two players left to their own devices are not going to sit down and go, but hey, I can really see it from your perspective. From your perspective, it must have been a bit like I fouled you, but it really wasn't like that. There's not going to be a talking through and working out of the situation. It's aggression, and that is what's going to happen. Let's take another example. I think we're all familiar with this situation when you have a breakdown of a couple, irreconcilable differences. There's a married couple, the marriage falls apart, and it gets so characterized by animosity and antagonism that there's going to be very little possibility, if any, that they could sit down amicably at some kind of negotiation table and work things out. In fact, sometimes you get this idea at the beginning of some kind of breakdown of a relationship, and invariably, of course, that doesn't work out. So in both of those examples, what I'm trying to suggest is we have some kind of imaginary contestation, some kind of imaginary conflict, some kind of imaginary aggressivity which is enacted and which cannot be peacefully resolved within the resources of the imaginary itself. There's a kind of appeal, the necessity, and I think I've put it down here, a need to appeal to something beyond the remit of those two subjectivities, a need to appeal to something at a different level to these two egos. And if we understand that point, then we're doing well in starting to move towards Lacan's notion of the big other. Now, you could argue that unless there was something like what Lacan's going to refer to as the symbolic big other, or the symbolic domain, the domain of rules, of language, of prohibition, of structure, if that didn't exist, then these intractable conflicts between two egos would simply result in a duel, in a kind of lethal situation. And you could argue that ancient Greek culture already has a way of thinking about this or illustrating this. And of course, I have in mind here the myth of Narcissus. We're not going to do a very textured, careful point-by-point analysis of the myth of Narcissus, but we're going to use it to suggest a series of themes. And we're doing that to do a kind of encapsulation of what we think the imaginary might be. In Narcissus, we have a subject who falls in love with an image. The image is one that gives them a fair amount of narcissistic pleasure, presumably. It's one that they fall in love with. It's one that they become fixated on. It's one that they're not able to remove themselves from. So much so that the end result is the death of Narcissus. So we have a kind of narcissistic attraction. We've got a kind of love, but we've also got the lethal dimension to that image. So bearing all of that in mind, let's give a quick tentative definition of the imaginary. And in order to do that, we're going to have a brief look at Dylan Evans's introductory dictionary of Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is a kind of a must-have book if you're starting out with Lacanian psychoanalysis. So here's just a brief extract. I will paraphrase him, skipping out a couple of lines, but just highlighting a few lines to give us our definition of the imaginary. The basis of the imaginary order continues to be the formation of the ego in the mirror stage. Okay, we've made that point. Mirror stage is the paradigm for thinking about this register of subjectivity, this broader order of the imaginary. Evans continues, the dual relationship between the ego and the ego's counterpart is fundamentally narcissistic. And narcissism is another characteristic of the imaginary order. Narcissism is always accompanied by a certain aggressivity. The imaginary is the realm of image and imagination, of deception and lure. The principal illusions of the imaginary are those of wholeness, synthesis, autonomy, duality, and similarity. Skipping on to the next page, he comments, the imaginary exerts a captivating power over the subject, founded in the almost hypnotic effect of the specular image. So I would add to that, I think that's a very helpful definition. As I put it up here, when we're thinking about the imaginary, and to reiterate once again, when we're talking about Lacan's notion of the imaginary, it needs to be thought in contrast to, alongside the notion of the symbolic and the real, which we will continue to describe as we continue these lectures. When we're thinking of the imaginary, we have in mind the domain of ego images and dual relations. We're thinking also of understanding, or misunderstanding, misrecognition, as we've already described. We're thinking of the domain of other as I as other, and we're thinking of the narcissistically loved image and aggressivity. Those are all useful ways of thinking about the imaginary. The only point that I would add to how Evans broaches the topic and how I've noted it here is that méconnaissance, that notion of misrecognition, constantly trying to see myself and thinking that's me. Those are also crucial elements of the imaginary order. That in place, we've now made, I think, a fairly convincing, fairly strong argument that left simply within the resources of the imaginary, we don't have something approaching a viable means of conflict resolution. There's no means of making some kind of pact. So here's the next step in the argument. Whenever you have two within the human domain, within the human world, which is made and informed both not just by imaginary, but also by the symbolic, whenever you have two subjectivities, you also implicitly have a third. So I sometimes jokingly say that in Lacanian algebra or Lacanian mathematics, you have 1 + 1 = 3. What? Or, to go back to the subtitle that we've given this is a definition, a kind of very minimal definition of how we might approach the notion of the big symbolic other as the third in any dialogue. Here's the example. You are on a plane. You arrive at Cairo airport, never been there before. You get out of Cairo airport, there's lots of people walking around speaking Arabic languages. If you're an English speaker, presumably watching this, you probably are. You may not be able to speak any of those languages. Lo and behold, you go and you sit down, you see someone with an apple, you show some interest, the person looks at you and he goes, would you like an apple? In that brief moment, you've got something miraculous that's happened. You've been able to have some kind of contact, some kind of communication with someone you've never met before from a completely different continent, and you're able to understand one another. In other words, you could say, whenever there is a minimal degree of communication between people, inasmuch as those people are able to communicate and understand one another, the minimal elements of that communicative exchange are not just one person and another person. Rather, that seemingly dual relationship has a mediating third point, the English language in my example itself. So keep that idea in mind, and let's keep on working with this theme, that whenever there's a dialogue that seems, not guaranteed to, but that seems to entail some kind of comprehension, some kind of understanding, that there's always a third point. Whether that is a shared language or whether it's a shared ideological viewpoint, but the other is that third point in any dialogue. And I kind of love this minimal definition because it's so counterintuitive. How can you have a third point in a dialogue? A dialogue is by definition between two. But that, I think, is the beauty of the point, that if you were even going to be able to have a dialogue, some kind of understanding, you need some third point of reference. Now let's work that phrase a little bit more. You need a third point of reference. So if me and my wife have a big argument about the definition of a word, intrepid, we're arguing about the meaning of intrepid, we will struggle and complain, and I'm very entrenched in what I think it means, she's very entrenched in what she thinks it means. We have, thank goodness, the prospect of looking in a dictionary, or these days increasingly maybe it's Wikipedia or it's online. There's a point of reference. There's some element, some apparent truth, some authority that we can appeal to beyond the remit of our two egoic subjectivities. If we didn't have that, presumably we'd have something akin to a kind of intractable conflict. So back to our whiteboard here. 1 + 1 = 3, or we have a third in any dialogue. There's our Cairo airport example, and I've already given the example of the referee that runs onto the field, of the sporting field, and separates the players. The referee is an instructive example here, because the referee doesn't just stand apart at a higher level or a different level from the two players, but the referee also embodies the rules of the game. So if we're starting to collect a series of very basic definitions of what this concept of the big other might be, we've already said that it could be the third in any dialogue. We could also say that in some level it is the embodiment of the rules of the game. It entails a set of rules, of restrictions, of how the game should work. I've mentioned here also the idea, this should be arbiter, but authority, point of appeal, or point of truth. In the dictionary example, or in a dispute, a judge would be a great example of some person who momentarily, or maybe for slightly longer than a moment, assumes the position of this arbiter, this person able to pronounce a certain kind of judgment from what seems to be an objective or neutral standpoint. So we have our two minimal definitions in place, and I think as we now start to draw to a conclusion with this first lecture on the notion of the big other, let us briefly explore what I've called the hovering interlocutor. And in doing so, I'm trying to respond to the question we posed right at the beginning. When I said, why is it that whenever there's an instance of speech, even if it's a monologue, even if I'm on my own, it implies a listener of sorts? Now, at the most obvious literal level, that doesn't work, because I can go lock myself up in my cupboard. Don't worry, not going to do it now, do it a little later. I can go and lock myself up in the cupboard and I can mumble a whole series of thoughts to myself. Maybe I'm frustrated with one of my children or whatever, and it's a rambling monologue. You could easily say, well, it's clearly just you talking to yourself. It's not meant for anyone. Lacan's general point, though, I think, is to ask another question. Why is it that even when I'm on my own, even when I'm completely on my own and I'm in my workshop and I'm hammering away with the hammer or doing something and I hurt myself, I suddenly utter a word. I'm not going to mention it now, but you can guess what word it might be. Some expletive. For me, that's always been fascinating. Why say some intelligible word that means something? You could also make the argument that in profanity always seems to involve a minimal degree of intelligibility. I can't just say, I suppose I could, but I use a word that's intelligible, a word that could be understood. And when I'm using profanity, a word that has offensive potential. In other words, in each of those instances, you could say that the very act of saying something at all implies a field of intelligibility. Doesn't mean an actual concrete listener, but a field of intelligibility. The whole premise of profanity seems to require that field of intelligibility precisely so as to be offensive. So this is the kind of idea when we're thinking about the hovering interlocutor. By virtue of the fact that one starts to use language, that when one speaks, even if it seems to be to oneself or to no one in particular, you are already expressing something with reference to how it could be heard, to a general field of intelligibility. And in so doing, one is putting in play something like the big other. To conclude, our nice example of this, the film recommendation of the week is a Robert Redford film called All Is Lost. And that's why I've put on the whiteboard the hovering interlocutor, or why Robert Redford is never alone in All Is Lost. All Is Lost is a film where Robert Redford plays this solitary yachtsman, sailor. He wakes up one morning to discover tragically that there's a breach in the hull of his sailboat. His radio's not working. In many ways, the film is the dramatization of multiple attempts that he makes to communicate his plight. And of course, time and time again, it fails. Now, you could argue that the film should kind of get boring pretty quickly because there's not going to be all that much by way of communication. There's large periods of the film where nothing much is being said because he's got no one to say it to. But you could say, even in that solitary moment, there's no one else there. Virtually all of his activity is somehow directed or aimed at putting a message in a bottle, which he does quite literally in the film. Put a message in a bottle. Another shout-out question. Who is that message for? putting a message in a bottle, going through a period of frustration and eventually shouting, "Ah!" and the bad expletive word that I didn't want to mention before. All of those moments, even when he's entirely on his own, seem to be conjuring up not just a field of intelligibility, but a potential listener, a wish that someone could hear. He's addressing his frustrations, his tragic realizations to someone, despite that no one hears them. Towards the end of the film, there's even this kind of quasi-religious element. And I suppose what I'm trying to say here is that even when you are completely on your own, even within the domain of your thoughts, in as much as you draw on language, in as much as that they are intelligible, at least to you, and within the terms of that language, to even think is to imply that field of intelligibility, which is, in Lacanian terms, can be thought of as the big other. And my last point here is then to say that maybe Wittgenstein is right. Actually, not maybe. It seems that Wittgenstein is right. Why do I say that? Well, there's lots of things that Wittgenstein says, but one element of Wittgensteinian philosophy, which is important here, is this idea that there's no such thing as a private language. And of course, the Lacanian articulation of there's no such thing as a private language means that whenever we use language, whenever we express ourselves with a singular swear word in an isolated situation, whenever we use language, we are by definition involving a public. We are by definition involving what he would call the big other. All right, let's wrap up then. Your homework exercise before our next lecture, kind of fun. You need to prepare a time capsule. Your time capsule, I don't know where you're going to bury it. If it was up to me, I'd say bury it in your garden. If you don't have a garden, I don't know, put it in your chimney. Hide it somewhere in your office if you've got an office. But what you've got to do, you've got to prepare a time capsule. I want 8 elements, at least a minimum of 8 objects in your time capsule. And then I want you to reflect on why you have included those items and for who.